I'm sure you've heard the term before, but for those of you that haven't, God Mode is a reference to the situation in gaming where you enter a code and your character immediately becomes invulnerable. They can run faster, jump higher, and do anything better than anybody else. Now, while this is fun to fantasize about when you're young and inexperienced, characters like that don't tend to be very compelling, and I'll tell you why. One of the most important elements in a story is characters that interest the audience and takes us along for the ride. Now, most writers do this by making sympathetic characters that we can identify with in some fashion because of shared or similar experiences. In other words, we relate to them because we have a common frame of reference, and if the story has done its job right, we care about what happens to them. Now, this is especially hard with God-moded characters for the simple reason that they're difficult to empathize with because of their invulnerability. Story doesn't exist without conflict, and if you have a character that can mow down 100 enemies without concern for their safety, then they quickly become uninteresting. A good story should always have an element of risk. There has to be at least the possibility that the hero may fail. If there isn't, then there's no payoff when you get to the ending because you already know he'll win. I tend to see this sort of thing most often in fanfics and inexperienced writers, and while they do tend to show up a lot of the times with Mary Sue and Gary Stu type characters, what tends to define them to the audience is the way they tend to interact with the world around them. God-moded characters usually have limited growth potential simply because when they can do anything, there's little reason for them to learn something new. A few examples just to show you what I'm talking about can be found in the NBC superhero drama Heroes. If you haven't seen the series, it's basically a story about a bunch of ordinary people that develop extraordinary abilities. I'd particularly like to call your attention to the two characters of Peter Petrelli, particularly in the second season, and Sylar for the first two. Now, I'll preface this by saying that I did not follow the series after Season 2 for the simple reasons that I'm talking about here. The show suffered from too large of a cast to really develop everyone properly if you ask me, and I was particularly bothered by the setup to Sylar, which seemed to peak early when his character was more fully revealed later on in the season. Now, the problem with both of these characters is that they each had the ability to collect other people's powers. Unlike Rogue from the X-Men, these were not temporary, both were able to collect abilities with neither limit nor consequence. Now, while this may have changed in later seasons, what turned me off from the show was that it created a very limited set of characters in that beyond Sylar's motivation to gather more powers, he, at least in my opinion, stagnated and peaked when there turned out to be no greater purpose to it other than his own desire for more. Despite his apparent loss of his abilities in the second season, his arc there was much the same as the first, collecting abilities but this time without the build-up to his introduction. Given his solitary and homicidal nature, his character held no interest to me. He was not doing it for a greater purpose so far as I knew, nor was he given any reason to evolve as a character. Rather than capturing my attention, he just got on my nerves since I failed to see why he was viewed as so interesting by the other characters. The second example particularly kicked into this mode in Season 2, when rather than the one or two abilities manifested in almost every other character seen so far, Peter somehow gained the ability to collect powers, becoming almost a Swiss Army knife of abilities by the end of the season. Now, while this was not the only problem during Season 2, in particular with Peter, it did not help that he was somewhat isolated from the rest of the main cast for the bulk of the season. Gathering more and more power, he just seemed to me to become less and less interesting, as while he did not possess the homicidal leanings or intentionally solitary nature of Sylar, I found little reason to be excited about his character since it was harder and harder to answer the question, why can't he just fill in the blank? Now, that question there is usually a good indicator that you have an overpowered character. If you find yourself looking at a character objectively and asking, why doesn't he just do whatever it is and overcome the obstacles his powers help him conquer, then you may have a character who has abilities greater than the story can accommodate. What I mean by that is, in particular, say we're dealing with a world where the character can teleport. In the case of a heist, you need to have a reason why they can't teleport straight into the vault. We also need to know that there are both countermeasures against such things as well as perhaps limits to their ability or reasons why they don't, such as PTSD. Perhaps they don't teleport places they can't see because the last time they did, they had a panic attack. The bottom line is that if the character can simply teleport anywhere at any time without being subject to either range limits, line of sight, or even needing to rest, you may have a God-moded character. Stories are all about hitting towards balance. Like nature, it's always trying to make its way to a place of equilibrium, also known as the status quo. With God-moded characters, this is made much more difficult for the simple fact that both sides must be made that much more powerful to counteract those kinds of characters. Consider what kind of antagonist you would need to beat someone who can literally do anything. How much stronger would they need to be to present a challenge? And can your audience relate to those characters? Note that God-moded characters don't necessarily have to have superpowers. They can just be an ordinary person, but remember that balance. They can be the best in their field, But if the antagonists don't present a challenge, it's hard for us to feel that when they take out 100 enemy agents without breaking a sweat. It's only interesting if they have that element of risk. Give them skills, but also give them flaws and challenges worthy of their abilities. Don't always let them win. While it may seem counterintuitive, sometimes placing limits on a character gives them more places for the story to go. When discussing this topic, I'm reminded of the argument provided for why people could not accept the first version of The Matrix. Simply put, it was too perfect. The same is true for well-designed characters. We've all got flaws and issues, things that both for good or ill make us who we are. And just like we wouldn't be the same people without the darker moments in our lives, characters work the same way. Think of the things we hold on to. They might be chipped, flawed, or cracked, but a lot of those marks come with stories, and those are the reasons why one thing matters to us when another of the same type doesn't. We form attachments based on those flaws and benefits, so the next time you think about what it would be like to be invincible, maybe instead you should think about how flaws shape who we are. You might just be surprised by how a couple limitations can add to a character.
Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!